Leaving a baby behind. Where have you been all this time? I could hear crying outside the house the whole time, bellowed my neighbor, George, with his wife, Julia, visible behind him. Even as I received cold stares from Julia and the neighbors who gathered like arrows, I couldn't understand what was going on. And for good reason. I don't have a baby in my house? I asked George, bewildered, and he looked at me in surprise. But George, insisting he heard a baby's cry, didn't back down. Similarly, the neighbors and Julia agreed, saying they too heard a baby. Please don't lie. We definitely heard a baby crying. But I don't even have grandchildren, I really don't know. It seemed my words weren't believed. Instead, the suspicion against me grew, as neighbors started giving me cold, hard stares. Then, the harassment worsened. Once, a paper labeled liar was stuck on my door, and a neighbor told me to stop causing trouble as we passed each other. Lately, I've been scared to even meet my neighbors, making going outside daunting. But that day, I had my annual health checkup, so I reluctantly went outside and hurried to the hospital. As I finished at the reception and waited, I saw a familiar face walking from the gynecology department. Emily! I couldn't help but call out her name. She was Emily Johnson, a childhood friend of David and the others. I ran up to her and started talking. Surprisingly, the truth she revealed became the key to solving this issue. My name is Susan Miller. After graduating from high school, I married a man I met through a blind date arranged by my boss at work. He was 10 years older than me, and while we often didn't see eye to eye, we somehow made our marriage work. 2 years into our marriage, I was thrilled to find out I was pregnant with our son, David. I had believed my husband would be happy too, but instead, he grew distant, refusing to acknowledge David and eventually asked for a divorce. After the divorce, I learned from acquaintances that my husband had been having an affair with a young woman who had recently started working at his company. The revelation that he had been unfaithful and was unwilling to even pay child support for our son filled me with anger. However, for the sake of my precious son, I continued to work, switching jobs after the divorce and starting a new life. Having lost my parents at a young age and with few relatives to rely on or friends to confide in, I felt anxious about raising David on my own. But seeing his smiling face when I came home gave me the strength to keep going. David grew up to be a kind-hearted and earnest young man, excelling academically through elementary, middle, and high school, and was expected to go to a prestigious university. However, he decided not to pursue higher education. Despite his teachers advising him to go to college, I worked extra shifts to ensure we wouldn't struggle financially if he chose to go. But he didn't want to burden me and chose not to attend. As a single mother working late nights, I worried him. His unexpected decision brought me to tears. I had always hoped he would go to college and learn as much as possible. Ideally, as a mother, I should have been able to support him through college, but he couldn't bear to see me work so hard anymore. Mom, I'm going to work too, so you don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm an adult now, he said. The thought of my son, who used to cry so much, worrying about me was incredibly touching. At the same time, I didn't want to make him worry any more than he already had. Once he started working, he began contributing to the household, which made it possible for me to work less. His stable job at a major company helped ensure a steady income. After 5 years of working, David married his childhood friend, Rhea, a kind and caring woman who worried about me and suggested we live together. David had been talking to Rhea about me since they got married. They even bought a new house for us all to live in together. So, I moved out of the cheap apartment I had lived in since the divorce and started living with David and his family. I'm so grateful to David, who has grown up and become a responsible adult. Thank you for everything you've done for me, I said to him, filled with gratitude and guilt. He replied with the same smile he's always had, saying he was happy to live with me. I want to give back to you for raising me on your own. I still remember tearing up at those words, deeply moved by my son's concern. Time has passed, and now David has been promoted and is doing well at work. I had hoped to see my grandchildren, but since both David and Rhea work, they haven't had children yet. Still, I started saving money, hoping it would help them in the future. My hardships are a small price to pay if it benefits my grandchild someday. You don't need to worry, Mom. I'm working too, David would say, looking concerned. I'd shake my head slightly and reply, I want to work. Having savings for emergencies is important. There was a time in the past when my ex-husband secretly got into debt over his obsession with gambling. When the repayment day came, he couldn't pay back, and scary people even showed up at our house. That time, I managed to settle the situation by giving away all the savings I had made in place of my ex-husband. Since then, I've been diligently saving money, keeping it in my bank account for any emergencies. It was about 1.5 years after I started my part-time job. That day, there was a family gathering, so I had been at my relative's house since morning. It had been years since our last meeting, so we had a lot of catching up to do, and time flew by quickly. Usually, Rhea and I share household chores, but that day she suddenly had to work, leaving me in charge. I needed to prepare dinner before David and the others returned home. When I hurried back home, I noticed a familiar face standing in front of the house. There were a few neighbors and George, our next-door neighbor. As I rushed to the front of the house, wondering what had happened, George, noticing me, suddenly burst out in anger.
Where have you been all this time, leaving a baby alone? The baby has been crying outside the house the whole time.
Behind George, who was yelling at me, I could see his wife, Julia. Faced with the cold stares of the neighbors and Julia, I was completely confused. There shouldn't be any baby crying at my house, as there were no children there. There's no baby at my house? I asked, perplexed. George looked at me in surprise. But he insisted that he had heard a baby crying. Agreeing with George, the neighbors and Julia also claimed they heard the baby's cries.
Don't lie. We definitely heard a baby crying.
But I don't have grandchildren either. I really don't know anything about it. My explanation didn't seem to convince them. Instead, the distrust towards me seemed to grow, and the neighbors started to glare at me coldly. In the end, no one listened to my side of the story. I decided to tell David and the others about the incident. David looked puzzled, but his wife, Rhea, just suggested it might have been a misunderstanding. But everyone heard the baby crying. Maybe it was the sound from the TV, or it could have been the vacuum cleaner that sounded like that. It's hard to believe that such sounds could be mistaken for a baby's cries. David didn't seem interested in identifying the source of the noise, just suggesting it was probably a mistake. As I struggled with my dissatisfaction, Rhea abruptly ended the conversation. If it's about ghosts, it's scary, right? Let's just drop this topic. Was Rhea always the type to cut into conversations and end them like this? But, faced with her cheerful voice, I couldn't say anything else. In the end, the cause remained unknown, and the topic was dropped. A few days later, as I was returning home from my part-time job as usual, I bumped into George and his wife. As we passed each other, I greeted them. But they didn't greet me back. Instead, George approached me angrily.
Enough is enough. Your baby is too loud.
As I said before, there's no baby at my house. Despite my words, George shook his head, insisting it was a lie, and began shouting in front of my house. The baby might be in danger. Don't scream at or hurt the baby, he irrationally accused. I pleaded with him to stop spreading baseless lies, but George wouldn't listen. As he continued to raise his voice in front of my house, neighbors started peeking out of their windows to see what was happening. Unable to withstand the stares of those around me, I eventually shouted out.
There's really no baby here. Please stop spreading lies.
As I said this, George glared at me intensely and spat out, "Liar," before walking away. I let out a small sigh over this baseless accusation. Why would they hear a baby's cry coming from my house? David and Rhea couldn't figure it out either, and it's not like Rhea had a secret child. The more I thought about it, the more it confused me, and I even started to get a headache. But the harassment from George and the others didn't stop there. Once, a paper labeled "liar" was stuck on my door, and another time a neighbor told me, "Stop causing trouble," as we passed each other. I tried discussing it with David, but we couldn't come up with any solution since neither of us had any clue. Amidst accumulating fatigue and worry, I continued with my daily life. Recently, I've been afraid to even meet my neighbors, making it hard to step outside. However, on that day, I had my annual health checkup and had to go out, so I quickly headed to the hospital. As I was waiting in the waiting room after registering, I saw a familiar face walking from the maternity ward.
Emily!
I instinctively ran up to her. She was Emily, a childhood friend of David and the others. When she saw me, she stepped back in utter surprise. As I approached her, I noticed she was holding a small sleeping baby in her arms. I hadn't heard anything about her getting married or pregnant from David, but it seemed she was now a mother. We used to play together with David and others, and she often came to our house. I was astonished to see that Emily, whom I hadn't met for so many years, now had a child. While surprised, I asked her when she got married. "I got pregnant, so I got married." She had already had a small wedding with just family, and now she was busy with her new life as a mother. Having raised David on my own, I understood the challenges of parenting. I asked if she wanted to have tea, but she politely declined with a troubled smile. That's when I felt something was off. Emily used to be more approachable, always wearing a bright smile, and would excitedly run up to me whenever we met by chance. But now, she just showed a strained smile and seemed to avoid getting into deep conversations, quickly leaving. The Emily who used to chat with me so freely seemed to have grown up and lost the carefree smile of her younger days. Feeling a bit sad, I waved goodbye to Emily. When I returned home from the hospital, I found a bunch of papers in my mailbox, complaining about the noise of a baby. Sighing softly, I took out the papers, only to notice George and his wife Julia watching me.
Your kid is too loud. Just get out of here. Every day, it's so annoying.
I ran into the house to escape their yelling. Inside, I blocked my ears to avoid hearing their continued shouts. For over a month, they kept accusing me of things that had no basis in reality. I had reached my limit with the ongoing harassment from the neighbors. Unable to handle it anymore, I discussed it again with David and Rhea when they returned from work that evening. I told them about the numerous verbal abuses from George and his wife and the increasingly severe harassment. I can't take their harassment anymore. I hate to leave this house, but could we consider moving? At first, I overlooked their behavior, but the recent harassment is just too much. David agreed, indicating he had been turning a blind eye to George's actions until now, but could no longer ignore them. I noticed Rhea, sitting next to him, looking unhappy about the idea of moving. I'm against it. I don't want to move. David and I exchanged looks, surprised by Rhea's unexpected reaction. We asked her why, and she explained that she didn't want to give up the house we had paid so much for. She said she didn't want to waste money buying a new place, especially since they were considering having children. But I couldn't stand the thought of enduring the endless harassment any longer. I'm absolutely against it. I can't imagine giving up something we've worked so hard for. Besides, my workplace is close to our home, and leaving here just isn't an option. I couldn't understand why Rhea, who was always so kind, was being so adamantly opposed. Indeed, her current job was at a company she had longed to join, and both the work and the company culture seemed to suit her well. If we moved now, Rhea might have to consider changing jobs, which could mean giving up work she loves. Me moving alone wouldn't solve anything. In the end, we didn't discuss moving any further, hoping instead that the harassment would stop. A few days later, I received a call about my health checkup results and, with a heavy heart, headed to the hospital. Fortunately, despite my age and David's concerns, there were no abnormalities found in my health. Relieved that the stress from the ongoing complaints hadn't manifested physically, I let out a small sigh while waiting for my bill. That's when I spotted a familiar face sitting with a baby in her arms. It was Emily, looking down at her baby with a dark expression and sighing repeatedly. Once so cheerful, I wondered what had happened to her. When I approached her, she seemed startled. She tried to speak, but then awkwardly turned away. I sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort. "You seem down. Is something wrong?" Emily shook her head and simply replied, "It's nothing." But her demeanor suggested she was hiding something. I looked directly at her and said, "Please, I want to help you. If you have any troubles, just talk to me." I couldn't believe such a once bright person could look so downcast. Finally, Emily seemed to resign herself to opening up, her voice heavy with resolve. "I'm a single mother. It's hard raising a child, working day and night, constantly worrying about money." I was speechless at her painfully honest revelation. But if she was working all day and night, I wondered who was taking care of her child. She couldn't find time for her child, struggling just to earn enough for childcare and living expenses. "Who takes care of your child when you're working?" "Ria looks after my baby." I was taken aback by her unexpected answer. "Ria works from morning till evening. How can she manage that with her job?" Emily, looking down, started to explain how she was troubling Ria. Apparently, Ria was the only one who knew that Emily had a child out of wedlock. Worried about Emily raising her child alone, Ria had offered to help take care of the child. Suddenly, George's words about hearing a baby's cries came to mind. "Ria is looking after your child? Could it be?" Emily hesitantly nodded in confirmation. While David and I were away, Ria had been taking care of Emily's child at our house. All this time, I thought the accusations were baseless, never imagining a baby was actually crying. Feeling guilty for thinking it was all unfounded harassment, I exclaimed, "Why didn't she talk to me about this? Even a little consultation would have been fine." Emily shook her head and said she would stop leaving her child with Ria. "I can't burden Ria anymore. She's already attracting attention at work because of this." It seems that Ria had been taking time off work to care for Emily's child, but her increasing absences had begun to raise suspicions from her boss. Recently, it's become harder for her to take time off. Emily declared that she would no longer rely on Ria and would take care of her child alone. I couldn't just stand by and watch Emily struggle. I wanted to help her in Ria's stead. I longed to see her smile again, like she used to. With that determination, I offered to take care of Emily's child. "There's no way I can just leave you struggling like this. Let me help." Emily, tears in her eyes and looking apologetic, thanked me. That very day, she explained the situation to Ria. This would relieve Ria of the need to take time off work to care for the child, and would alleviate Emily's parenting anxiety. I immediately discussed the situation with my workplace and managed to reduce my shifts, deciding to take care of the child. The child, still very young, was quiet, ate well, and slept soundly, but initially cried loudly upon realizing I was not their mother. It reminded me of David when he was young, bringing back nostalgic feelings. But there was no time to indulge in nostalgia. I had to inform George and the others about the real situation. "Hey, I need to talk to you about something." I showed Emily the papers accusing us of lying about the baby's cries that George and his neighbors had been posting. Although she looked shocked, I explained the situation and suggested we go to George's house to apologize. Emily, unaware of the situation, looked remorseful, but I was sure George would understand once we explained. On another day, Emily and I went to George's house to discuss the matter. I hoped that a proper explanation and apology might stop the harassment. As we rang George's doorbell, he answered.
"So, you've finally come to admit to the crying baby, you liar,"
George shouted as soon as he saw us. Startled, I was about to speak, but it was Emily who raised her voice. "Why are you here?" she asked George, her face turning pale and tears beginning to form in her eyes. She moved protectively behind me. But it was George who showed the most panic.
"Why are you here? I told you we were done with each other."
At the sight of Emily, George's anger was apparent. Julia also appeared, asking,
"Who's that woman? And why is this liar here?"
Overwhelmed by Julia's intensity, I opened my mouth to explain the situation. But just at that moment, Emily, who had appeared behind me, glared at Julia and shouted,
"He's my ex-boyfriend. This child is his." He refused to acknowledge the child.
At Emily's harsh words, not only Julia but also I were left stunned, turning our gaze to George in disbelief. It turns out George had been dating Emily a few years ago and was cheating on her with Julia. Emily, unaware of this, had told George about her pregnancy, but he chose young Julia over her, refusing to acknowledge the child and abandoning them. He had even changed his contact details, leaving Emily to raise the child alone without any support. Julia, her face turning red with anger, directed her fury at George.
"What do you mean? I was the other woman. Don't joke with me."
Julia screamed at George, who frantically tried to explain himself. I was appalled by the whole scene.
"If I had known it would come to this, I would have kicked them out sooner,"
George yelled, pointing at me. He started to explain. Apparently, George had accidentally discovered that Rhea and Emily were childhood friends, and had seen Rhea taking care of his child. Panicking, George had been trying to drive us out before Emily could learn about his marriage to Julia.
"It's your fault for coming here. If you had left, I wouldn't be in this mess."
George's selfish reasoning made me sigh. He had deceived both Emily and Julia, neglecting not only pregnant Emily but also his own child, living comfortably himself. But then, it was Emily who spoke up.
"Do you have any idea how much suffering you've caused me? And to think, you cheated not just on me but with someone else too."
Emily's words, spoken in a cold tone, visibly drained the color from George's face. "It's all in the past," George replied quietly, only to be interrupted by Julia, who began to gather her belongings, glaring at him.
"This is over, George. You cheated and had a child without telling me? That's the lowest. If I had known, I never would have married you."
She declared her intention to leave. George, apparently caught off guard by Julia's reaction, desperately tried to stop her, but she spat out that she would divorce him and demand alimony. That day, we left George's house, unable to do anything further. Julia's outcry was so loud it seemed to have prompted complaints from the neighbors, and it appears they eventually divorced. Emily, too, consulted a lawyer about George's failure to pay child support. Thanks to all of you. I never even considered consulting a lawyer, thinking I had to do everything myself. It costs money and time, but I plan to have the lawyer calculate everything that's owed. George was eventually ordered to pay child support, including the back payments he had missed. He started working a second job, desperately trying to make enough money. Meanwhile, with less financial worry, Emily reduced her work hours, gradually increasing the time she could spend with her child. Emily and I have kept in touch, and I've been able to enjoy a good relationship with her and her child. Recently, I've noticed her smile returning, the one she had lost. With George and his family gone, a peaceful daily life has returned to us. After several months of this tranquil life, on a beautifully clear autumn day, I received exciting news from Rhea about her pregnancy. David, who had longed for a child, was overjoyed at the prospect. It looks like our days are about to become busy again. I'm eagerly waiting for the arrival of my grandchild, enjoying a blissful life.